Hello everyone, and welcome to the long-awaited, by someone other than me, I'm sure. Hi Steinbeck. Clearly Steinbeck has been waiting for this video. Round glass review for the Olympus. Round glass review for the Olympus G Zuiko 50mm f1.2 vintage manual focus lens. That's right, this lens was made by Olympus. Now, production commenced in the early 1970s with some disagreement among the sources I read about exactly when. LensDB indicates 1972, Mir indicates as early as 74 with nothing conclusive before that. Both of them are very good sources, but I'm going to go with 72 on this. The lens was replaced by the next iteration of it in 1982. This lens looks at the G Zuiko, which was the 1970s lens. It is a fast general lens for portraits, low light, and precise focus when stopped down. And the way that old-timey lenses that were of this speed were designed to be used is that you'd use f1.2 to obtain your focus, and then you'd be shooting it around 4 to 5, 6. You'd have very precise focus and good sharpness. If you're new to this series, there won't be any test charts or situations where I intentionally set this lens up to succeed or fail. The reviews here are based on real-world use and aim to provide images and video that mimic how you're likely to actually use this lens, with only a handful of supporting images that show how it performs in different, specifically set up situations. For those of you who are looking at the timestamp and thinking, no way am I going to watch all of this, here's the general point. This isn't the lens you buy to do everything. The flaws in it limit the usability for very many subjects. However, for key subject types like portraits especially, and other subjects where short telephoto lens use really benefits your photography, and where the image character that this lens imparts on your subjects can complement that subject, this lens can perform very well when you embrace the look. So giving you the standard specs, which are pretty well available almost everywhere with just a simple Google search, the focal length and AOV on this lens are 55mm and 42.9 degrees on the diagonal for full frame, with an equivalent of 83mm and approximately 30 degrees again on the diagonal for APS-C shooters. Your aperture range is 1.2 to 16 in full stops once you reach f2. The element and group count are 7 and 6. It's a double gauze lens design with a filter thread of 55mm. Closest focus is 0.45 meters. It is manual focus only. The native mount was Olympus OM 35mm for the old vintage 35mm SLRs. The lens size is 65 by 47mm, and it's a chonky little guy weighing in at 310 grams. Alright, here's my top tip for you. Back when this lens was designed, it would not have been designed for wide open use except when absolutely needed. So, you can get more from this lens by shooting it around f4 to f8 because many of the lens flaws are eliminated or at least highly controlled by then. As for good subjects to use this lens with, it's a good generalist lens with strong portrait capabilities. As a walk-around lens, it's only okay. With portraits, it really handles subjects with special care. If you shoot portraits, this lens really shines on full frame. For you portrait shooters out there, think of and treat this lens like an ultra-short tele with a minimal amount of soft focus adjustment applied, and you will have the best results that it can provide. For poor subject choices, architecture is a poor subject choice due to the lens's general softness and fast aperture, barrel distortion, and field curvature. Astrophotography is discouraged because of the softness, coma especially because of the coma, propensity for ghosting and flaring with stray light sources, and again the field curvature. Technical documentation and document reproduction are also not recommended either, again due to field curvature. For metering modes, I used matrix, or whatever Sony calls it, I can't remember their term right now, average, center-weighted, spot, and multi-spot. And all of them worked very well. No specific metering mode is recommended over another for this lens specifically, except in cases, such as portraits, where biasing your meter to your subject tends to yield better results. Another tip is that if you want to minimize light loss and coma, You can shoot APS-C or Micro Four Thirds with this lens. Now the downside is that the smaller formats will likely exaggerate the field curvature, which is most noticeable at the image's center and peripheries around the center, but that largely is rectified as you stop the lens down. Also, for mirrorless shooters on small sensors, felt lining your adapter will help you minimize adapter flare, which does affect this lens. Adapter flare is a term I'm appropriating from large format photography, and it means that stray light from the part of the image circle projected by the lens that extends beyond the imaging area in the camera bounces around inside the camera and causes diffuse unfocused light to reach the film or sensor, reducing contrast. This is most noticeable when mounting an adapter that has a narrow throat. Also, this may be the only time I say this, but this lens does not benefit from being used with a macro-focusing adapter on your mirrorless camera. The depth of field becomes unusably small at most any aperture as you rack the focus on this lens out past the designed minimum focus distance, and flaws, especially coma and field curvature, become unmanageable. Fortunately, the close focus on this lens is highly usable for the focal length. One other note. LensDB.com indicates that this lens is not compatible with teleconverters. I don't know if that's due to the rear element size and shape or the way the light exits the lens. I didn't try this lens with a TC, but I thought that note was worth pointing out. Well, not much to really go over here with this lens. It's like a textbook double gauze design, typical of early 70s double gauze lenses. It's pretty much a run-of-the-mill fast double gauze lens design. Not really all that exciting. But I'll give you a little bit of time here to read what I put into the graphic anyway. For breathing, I'm going to note up front that this is an extreme test. We're going from closest to furthest focus. So, breathing wide open in that test is so great that foreground objects just become diffuse blurs, and that's because they're basically magnified almost out of existence. And that's the case with ultra-fast lenses in general. Stopping the lens down to f5.6 and repeating the same test for, honestly, which this lens was never designed, does show significant breathing. The magnification changes on this lens are significant in the closer focus ranges, generally meaning focus close enough that you can't fit an entire person in the frame. At further distances, breathing is far less noticeable. So, for practical application in video, where you use this lens to change focus between two people in a scene, especially if you are up close to them, say half body height or less, breathing would likely be noticeable and distracting. The aperture is stepped at full stops, starting at, well, it's stepped at f1.2 and then again at f2, so there's more than a full stop break there, but the detents are at full stops across the rest of the range. So if you want to use this lens for video with aperture changes in your shot, you either need to remove the detent bearing or find an adapter with an aperture open-close ring that you can use for stopping down, or, alternatively, since this lens, like all Olympus lenses, has a depth of field preview button on it, you can remove the adapter's aperture pin. This is your OM to mirrorless adapter that I'm talking about. Remove the aperture closure pin that's inside of that adapter, and then you can use the depth of field preview button, carefully, to slowly close the aperture. And that can be a workaround for this as well, which would let you treat it basically like a preset lens, and then the aperture would close down smoothly if you try to do that. The front element is non-rotating, but does extend around 1.5 centimeters, which for those of us in the US is 0.005468 yards. Focus throw is around 185 degrees, which is ample for fine focus control. The focus ring is stationary, making motorized focus use simple to achieve. Focus damping, as with the following two categories, is heavily your mileage might vary based on how much your lens was abused in the last 50 years. For me, damping was great, and it's one of the best lenses I own for that, with uniformly smooth focus that holds well and with an appropriate resistance. Focus ring play was minimal coming out of infinity and undetectable at all other focus points. The play at infinity with my lens specifically is likely due to age and previous owners mashing this lens back to infinity many hundreds or thousands of times in the course of normal use over the last 5 decades, and that action forming a small deformation in the lens helicoid at the infinity hard stop. Mount stability on mine was exceptional, as is the case with Olympus lenses writ large. This lens, due to its weight, seems to have an extra robust mount. For sharpness, wide open, it is soft, even by 70s lens standards. It does improve around f4 pretty well, but in general, this lens is always going to be slightly softer than other 50mm lenses. You should use that softness to your creative advantage, however. The build quality is very good. This model lens is prone to oily aperture blades. Now that said, on mine specifically, the oily blades that my lens has cause this lens to still be in the process of stopping down, especially at smaller apertures, as the image is taken, which causes a smoother out-of-focus area, and that improves the transition from sharp to blurry areas. If you've seen my very old video on the Minolta STF, it's kind of a similar effect to what that does. So my copy of this lens specifically performs far differently in those aspects on film than on digital, and the out-of-focus area characteristics on film are much more pleasing than they are with digital, because with digital adapters, they force the aperture to close before the photo is taken, but with film, the aperture, like I said, is still stopping down when the photo is taken. For contrast, it's generally fine as long as you have no in or frame adjacent lighting. This lens is highly prone to in-lens flare that saps contrast as well as adapter flare on small sensor cameras, but the adapter flare severity is largely based on your specific adapter's throat diameter. Aperture shape and blade count are 8 blades with a generally circular aperture to f2 and then a strongly octagonal aperture thereafter. So your out-of-focus area characteristics tend to be jittery with some coma-induced out-of-focus area swirl in the foreground, and that's when you have focus beyond your foreground, specifically at fast apertures. Stop down, the depth of field this lens provides largely eliminates out-of-focus areas, and the in-focus areas are excellent. Light loss is very severe at f1.2, but it's eliminated to the point where it won't be noticed in images by f4. Distortion, as to be expected with any vintage double gauze lens, especially in ultrafast, is there, and it's barrel distortion. In practical application, this isn't highly noticeable except with strongly straight lines, such as with blinds, graph paper, buildings, and so forth. For most real-world subjects, the barrel distortion will not affect your images. In terms of design flaws, the flare and ghosting are substantial with this lens. Field curvature and coma exist in keeping with typical performance of early 70s double gauze designs. Other high-order aberrations are eliminated well enough to not affect images. All the flaws this lens has give it the character it imbues into images, and if you want to try this lens, you would serve it and yourself well to embrace those flaws and not try to find ways around them. For balance with cameras, it's good with heavy cameras, but very front-heavy with light cameras. That applies also to the vintage 35mm OM series cameras, for which this lens feels fairly front-heavy. The Zuiko 55mm f1.2 lens is a product of its era, both in terms of design, function, and use. What I mean is that the image performance is limited by the engineering and computational design capabilities of the late 60s and early 70s. The function is typical of the best manual focus lenses, with a long focus throw for precise focusing and a large, pleasing focus ring to hold on to. The use is limited by this lens's original intent to be used only on still film cameras. In the article about this lens on mir.com.my, Leo Fu asks the reader to look at their portfolio and see how many of their good images were taken on 50mm class lenses. Leo makes the claim that only the best photographers can take great photos on standard lenses, a claim I disagree with if for no better reason that very many of my best photos are taken on standard lenses. So, if you're a photographer who feels intimidated by standard lenses, don't be. These are good lenses that take nice photos and they replicate the world in a manner fairly true to how we see it. For the Zuiko 55mm f1.2, this is a lens that has significant optical flaws that owe to the design limitations of its time. Today, images like this lens creates are sought out by many portrait photographers ensconced in the ultra-fast lens portrait fad. And yes, this is quite a good portrait lens. Sure, yes, it works for portraits wide open, as many of the portraits in this video show, but it shines the brightest for portraits from f4 to f5.6 with your subject shoulders up, filling the frame. This lens is at its absolute best when the focus gets racked out almost as far as it will go. So yes, the standard lens class is versatile and highly usable and readily accessible, and if you want, you can really push into the obscenely expensive class of standard lenses with one like this. And if you choose to do that, honestly, this is one to look at. I've used now 6 or so 1.2 and 1.1 standard lenses, and this is the best. It bests quite easily the Nikkor of the same vintage as well as the Canon from the 70s. And that's in terms of image quality and subject rendering and also, specifically, out-of-focus area characteristics. The Olympus Zuiko 55mm f1.2 handles beautifully with smooth and appropriately resistive focus, an easy aperture ring, and a substantial size that is easy to grip. The 55mm 1.2 renders portraits beautifully and handles most general photography subjects fairly well. And I think, maybe, that this is the best thing I can say about this lens. I'm not a fast lens nut. Speed is overrated. This lens, however, stands as an exception to that rule, and if you only ever want to try one fast lens, this would be the one worth trying.